The day was January 16th, 1945. The most feared and oppressive force the world has ever known was on the brink of collapse during one of the darkest periods in human history. The Führer, defeated, cowered within Deutschland, licking his wounds. The world would soon be rid of this nightmare. Having abandoned the very people he inspired to fight for him, as his minions fruitlessly fought tooth and nail to the bitter end on the surface, the maniacal leader of the German army, Adolf Hitler, and a small group of his confidants retreated underground to the Führerbunker, going mad as they await their imminent doom. This was it for the tyrannical lunatic. These were his final days. Decorated only with the finest creature comforts and the most high-class artwork, straight from the Reich Chancellery itself, the Führerbunker was made to be a place Hitler could comfortably reside in indefinitely. The bunker, located in Berlin, was vastly complex and entirely self-contained. However, as it was below the water table, conditions could become unpleasant and damp. As the end of the war beckoned, this subterranean fortress seemed like the best chance of survival. And so Hitler used this place as a domain with which to desperately and cowardly control his subordinates from a safe distance. Nazi politician Joseph Goebbels also made the decision to move below ground with his family to be alongside their beloved leader.
Joseph Goebbels is the Nazi propaganda minister. So he's in charge of cinema, books, the nascent TV industry. He's in charge of all the methods of communication. And so he's in charge of getting the Nazi message out, effectively. And now he is married to a very sort of striking blonde woman called Magda. Now Magda has been married before to a very wealthy German industrialist, but she eventually gets divorced and marries Joseph Goebbels, who was a real Casanova, actually. Even though he was short, club-footed, and not an attractive man, he had a lot of sexual conquests.
Others to join Hitler underground were handpicked by him, such as a select few SS officers, to act as his personal bodyguards, keeping him informed of what was happening above. A telephone switchboard enabled the tyrant to bark orders at his minions far away from the front lines. Martin Bormann, Hitler's powerful and feared secretary, also had an office within the bunker, maintaining his control and position as one of his closest associates.
Martin Bormann is one of the most enigmatic and cryptic figures of the Third Reich. He was one of the kind of old fighters, as it was called. He was kind of there from the very early days. Very loyal Nazi, but always in the shadows. He was head of what was called the Chancellery, and as a result, he actually had the kind of keys to Hitler, if you liked. If you want to go and speak to Hitler, you've got to go through Bormann. Doesn't matter who you are, everyone's got to go through Bormann. And so that gives him enormous power, because if he can say you can and you can't, you've got to curry favour with him. And of course, in any dictatorship, whoever's the nearest to the dictator is going to have the most power after the dictator.
Conference rooms were also a major part of the bunker, a place for the men to gather and discuss the military situation and how to progress with the war, dictating all this from 28 feet under. Hitler's words, once inspiring to his loyal followers, fell short of the enormity of war, as if buried underground with him. The Red Army were fast approaching, and with no clear eyes on the front line, Hitler and his associates were unaware of the severity of the situation.
Once the Red Army came into German territory in 1945, then Hitler's position as this infallible ruler and leader really not only became to be called into question, but really came to its end, because the Soviet troops were very vengeful. They were retaliating for all the terrible brutalities and atrocities that the Nazis and the German army had put into place in Soviet territory.
Life in the bunker was delusional. Everyone pretending that Germany was winning the war. Everyone ignoring the reality that a shadow was being cast upon their grand empire. Adolf Hitler was once the most powerful dictator and leader Germany had ever seen. His charisma and ability to influence a nation carried him into power in 1933.
On the 30th of January 1933, Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany, but of a coalition government. So there were just 3 Nazi posts in that coalition government.
It's very tempting to think that when Hitler comes to power in early 1933, that his grip on power is absolutely total. In fact, he has a very uneven, shaky start. He's still quite worried about public opinion. So what he does is a mixture of passing various laws that give him more and more power, like the Enabling Act, that actually makes him immensely powerful. But also, he takes advantage of various events like the Reichstag fire, in which the German Parliament building burns down. Now, it's highly likely, but never proven, whether the Nazis actually burnt it down themselves. But certainly, in a sense, it doesn't matter. What happens is that Hitler and the Nazis took advantage of the Reichstag burning down to show that there was a communist plot against what the Nazis described as still being a democratic government. And it enabled them to seize more power, by emergency decree.
Very quickly, he turned Germany into a one-party state. So first of all, he made sure to eliminate the influence and power of the German political left. So the Socialist Party and the Communist Party, for a start, were banned. But over a short amount of time as well, the Nazi Party was the only legal party too.
And eventually, in January 1933, he becomes Chancellor. Now, don't forget, Chancellor in Germany, and this still remains today, is not, at the time, the head of state. The head of state is the president. So it's the Chancellor, though, who has the real executive power. In order to take as much power as he can, he's also going to have to make himself head of state. And that really becomes an opportunity for him when Hindenburg dies, and he's able to take on the role of both president and chancellor and kind of create this new role for himself, and that is the role of Führer, the German word for leader. That is a fascist term, be in no doubt. This is a kind of new form of governance that Germany now has. Other parties are banned. The only party allowed is the Nazi Party. This has become a totalitarian state, and Hitler can say to the German people, you voted for it. It's a con, and it's a con that worked.
With a God complex drilled into his mind, Hitler saw himself as the only leader Germany ever needed. He used democracy to build popularity, which gave him an iron grip over the once proud people of Deutschland.
You have a lot of laws being passed, unsurprisingly, to give the Nazis more power. But also you've got a rise in the apparatus of state terror. You have a thing called the Gestapo, now completely notorious, but that stands for Secret State Police. This is a new police force. There's already the Kripo, the criminal police. But this is a new type of policeman. It's a policeman who is in plain clothes. It's a policeman who recruits informers, on every block, on every street, and every block of flats, in order for the people to effectively police themselves. And of course, this becomes an incredibly important part of the Nazi apparatus.
The citizens had full support for Hitler, unaware of the horrors to unfold during his reign of terror.
He had the idea of a very aggressive and expansionist foreign policy, and essentially this idea of might over morality, so force over anything rational, I suppose, in a way, force in terms of foreign affairs. And of course, the League of Nations was designed to promote peace and to enhance international relations and security, of course, too. And so this was why Hitler wanted to remove Germany from it. And in addition, this was then going to allow him to start to tear up the Treaty of Versailles in the way that he had hoped and intended all along.
Hitler's being expansionist. He wants more territory. He's looking to Czechoslovakia, to an area called the Sudetenland, where he's identified people who he thinks should rightfully be Germans. And he thinks that those people should be part of the new Nazi Germany. He, of course, is also looking east towards Poland and thinking, maybe I want a bit of that. And he's also, of course, looking down to Austria, which, of course, is a German-speaking country, and thinking maybe I want to have Austria as part of my new kingdom, if you like. So it's a mixture of slowly absorbing more power into himself, but also then using that power to go out and grab more land.
On September 1st, 1939, Hitler launched an attack on Poland, underestimating the start of World War II. Hitler divulged a concept called blitzkrieg, a lightning war, to his German public. He dictated it as to be a war of racial annihilation. No mercy, no survivors.
In September 39, Hitler invades Poland, along with Stalin. Stalin also, Soviet Russia, also invades Poland at the same time. But what the world remembers is the fact that Hitler invaded Poland, and a couple of days later, the British declare war on Germany. But Hitler's advance through Poland was really quick. It was lightning quick. And actually, the German word blitzkrieg literally means lightning war.
The German population, because of Hitler's popularity, and even though they had experienced the horrors of the First World War and the trench warfare of the First World War and all of the shell shock and everything that went with it, because he was so popular, they might not have been delighted to go to war in September 1939, but they went along with it.
Within just 6 weeks, Poland was devastated by the German army, and tens of thousands of Poles executed. The 2 million Jews living in Poland now found themselves under the thumb of Adolf Hitler. A grisly and harrowing fate was soon to follow. Anyone who did not fit the bill of Hitler's perfect Aryan race were to be quickly and violently removed from society.
So we know that from as early as Hitler's writings in Mein Kampf that he was personally anti-Semitic. And what we see once the Third Reich comes into power is his personal anti-Semitism translated into state policy. So from the very earliest days and months of the Third Reich, there were many different measures, legal measures taken against the Jews, and also illegal measures as well.
Just as he had promised in Mein Kampf, Hitler is treating the Jews in Germany as an internal enemy. So what you see are laws stripping Jews of their German citizenship. You see awful things like Jews not being allowed to go to swimming pools, because if a Jew swam in a public swimming pool, the water would have to be drained because the Jew had dirtied the water. So you can see that you've got this sort of awful both political and cultural exclusion of the Jewish community.
Back in Germany, the citizens were under the impression that Germany is all great and all powerful. Hitler's most evil plans were still yet to be revealed. Hitler brainwashed his army with the notion that nobody is superior to the Aryan race. Therefore, all means of violence and mass murder will be tolerated in order to exterminate those who do not fit in.
Hitler is always mindful of public opinion. I think that it's always important to remember that Hitler, does always worry about what the German people think about him. He doesn't just sort of seize power in 1933 and then not care. He wants to be liked, he wants to be popular, he is a political leader after all, and all political leaders, democratic or fascist or otherwise, want to be liked. Now, the best way to make yourself liked is to project an image that the people can identify with or respect or admire. And what he does is he uses propaganda and photography and film to show him as this kind of almost sort of messianic figure.
In 1940, Hitler's all-powerful army ruled over Denmark, Norway, Holland, and Belgium, and eventually crushes France with their number of tanks.
Really, one of the high points of Hitler's popularity was the image of the Nazis taking over Paris. So all of these attacks were very sort of quick and easy victories for the Nazis, and they just fed Hitler's success and popularity.
This was the greatest evil force the world had ever seen. These successes only fueled Hitler's ego, which left him with no hesitation to invade Stalin's Russia, despite their previous peace pact. The army captured Soviet prisoners of war, sending them to starvation camps for their final days, with 2.6 million perishing from hunger. 500,000 others were brutally murdered for quick, convenient extermination.
In August 1939, just before the Second World War broke out, an alliance was made between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. And this seems very strange because we've already said how Hitler hated anything to do with Bolshevism, communism, and indeed the USSR was his ultimate enemy. The idea of eradicating socialism and Bolshevism from the earth was one of Hitler's main priorities. So it seemed a bit anomalous that they would make a pact like that. But of course, he was just trying to pave the way and make the circumstance right for the war and the situation in Poland, so it would be easy, as the attack on Poland was. But then we saw as well how Hitler's very happy to tear up a treaty when it doesn't suit him. So on the 22nd of June 1941, the Nazis invaded the USSR with Operation Barbarossa.
Stalin's had this pact with Hitler for years, and he's thinking Hitler's never going to invade. Oh dear. Hitler goes straight in, June 1941, and again the Blitzkrieg, Operation Barbarossa, as it was called in this instance, was tremendously successful. And initially the forces just went through Russia like a knife through butter.
Even from the youthful age of 21, Hitler's main policies for Nazism were already coming into effect, promoting and encouraging intense rage and violent acts, extreme nationalism, and the utter loathing of the Jewish people. Attaining power in 1933 allowed him to enforce his own deplorable views on a nation. He proclaimed the Nazi Party the only legal political party in Germany, unleashing his SS to attack other political party leaders and those that followed.
The Nazi regime absolutely hated the Jews and wanted to get rid of them from the very beginning. So we see that with some of the earlier policies, but as we get into the wartime period, of course, the policies become more and more radicalized, more and more extreme. So this idea, essentially the Nazis created this idea of a Jewish question or a Jewish problem that needed a solution. And throughout the course of the Third Reich, they put into place a variety of different measures to try to deal with their so-called Jewish problem.
Hitler's plans for the Jews, and when he decided to slaughter them, still remain a topic of a lot of historical controversy, because there is no piece of paper that says, "Kill all Jews," signed A. Hitler. But I think that what is absolutely clear is that in conversation, he would have said to his, top leaders, we need to start killing these people. Hitler was smart enough to know this shouldn't be on a piece of paper. The initial idea is that the Jews are rounded up into ghettos, and from those ghettos they can then be sent to concentration camps where they can be worked and worked to death. And you see these camps all over occupied Poland and all over Germany itself. Suddenly, around the time of Barbarossa, 41, it starts to get actually eliminationist. And you have what's called Action Reinhardt, in which you've got the establishment of 4 actual death camps in what was occupied Poland.
Brutal attacks, imprisonment, or even murder. Anything to remove them as a political opponent. That's how the SS did business. Obtaining total support from the German people not only fed his ego, but allowed him to believe he could get away with anything, including the murders of over 6 million Jews. 1935 saw the introduction of the Nuremberg Laws. Hitler began to convince the German people that the Jewish were to blame for Germany's decline. Marriage between Jews and German people became illegal. Jewish people were stripped of their citizenship and all their civil rights. Unfortunately for the Jewish community, this was only the beginning of what this monster had in store. Within 1938 came the Night of Broken Glass. Which saw the destruction of over 7,000 Jewish shops and 400 synagogues burnt to the ground. 30,000 Jews were arrested and sent to concentration camps, where they would see out the rest of their lives in torture and despicable conditions. The vast majority of the German people were unaware of the inhumane treatment that took place in these camps. Realizing the severity of Hitler's anti-Semitism only when it was far too late.
We also associate the Holocaust with just people being gassed in gas chambers, but also Jews were slaughtered just by being shot next to vast pits, which would then just be buried over. And this was just the most horrific form of genocide. I mean, gassing, of course, is horrific too. But the idea that you would just shoot a baby in the head in front of its mother, and then shoot the mother, and this would be your day in, day out job. It beggars belief that supposedly ordinary men in these SS police battalions could go around doing this kind of work, but they did. And it was eventually recognised by the Nazis that actually the kind of psychological toll it was having on those carrying out the murders was so great that they had to work out a nicer way to kill Jews, i.e. through maybe lorries with gas going into them, or maybe even gas chambers. So gas chambers are actually invented primarily to spare the sanity of the murderers. That's how twisted Nazi logic becomes.
With the German people feeling positive and patriotic, focusing on the war, Hitler could enforce the most brutal horrors of the Third Reich. Special death squads were sent specifically to murder the Jews, hunting them down like dogs and barbarically forcing the victims to dig trenches, stand inside, and await execution. Groups were continuously sent into these grim trenches, standing on the bodies of their own deceased kin, being forced to die in the most inhumane way possible, all just to fill up the trenches with Jewish corpses. A staggering 1.5 million Jews were shot in this process. And yet, even these sick, brutal executions weren't the worst of it. Not even close. In secret, Hitler's inner circle were experimenting with other forms of mass murder that could be deemed more efficient. This became known as the final solution.
The Wannsee Conference really was that moment, a kind of very important moment in the evolution of Nazi anti-Semitic policy and in what we call the final solution, because this was the moment that both retrospectively sanctioned what had already been going on, these experiments at the end of 1941 and really set in place then the momentum for the establishment and running of these death camps. And there were 6 of those, all of them on Polish soil through the height of the war. The Germans were involved, in their own experience of the war, preoccupied with their own difficulties. And in a sense then, once the Jews weren't there anymore, they were sort of out of their frame of reference and just not in their thoughts.
He never personally signed a document for these killings, keeping his own image in the public's eye clean. However, all the other Nazis acted in his name, organizing this destruction themselves, as if in tribute to their glorious leader. In attempts to shield his reputation further, Hitler moved the killings from Germany, with the idea they must happen as far away as possible. Building a network of death camps in Poland, this was the beginning of the final solution. Jews from all over Europe were transported to these camps, unaware of the inhumane scenarios they were about to face. These men, women, and children, families, were slaughtered day after day, made to witness it all and suffer with every waking second. They knew nothing inside those fences but death, misery, pain, and dread, all because of the sick ideals of one twisted egomaniac.
Death camps, all of those were on Polish soil, so they were out of the immediate frame of sight or reference of the Germans. So again, in some way, they were happening elsewhere and not really in their immediate field of vision.
These are places that are places of deep, deep horror, because you didn't go there to work, you went there to die. And you would arrive, and within 30 minutes, you'd be dead. Treblinka, for example, is no bigger, if you visit it, than a football stadium, the size of a football pitch. And in that very small area, around 850,000 men, women and children were gassed. It's just the most horrific thought if you ever visit a place like that. Auschwitz, again, a very huge, iconic place associated with the Holocaust, of course, famously where 1 million Jews were put to death, many of whom were gassed on arrival. But it also was a concentration camp rather than just an extermination camp. So it has these 2 horrific roles. And don't forget, Auschwitz and places like this, they're huge. Auschwitz is 3 camps spread over about 10 miles. I mean, these are factories of death. There's no doubt about it.
All members of the Nazi Party were required to be a part of the final solution, as it was genocide on a mass scale. Hitler needed as many pawns to do his bidding as humanly possible. To dissolve any guilt from the German people, he proclaimed, "The Jews have brought destruction upon themselves, and they deserve the misery only they've created." In July of 1944, some resistance was developing within Hitler's own supporters after they began to realize he's full of empty promises. Soldiers had begun turning against him with the belief that Hitler was not strong enough as a war leader, and he was fighting the war badly. An attempt was made on Hitler's life. A bomb was planted in a briefcase and kept under the table at one of his meetings. Hitler survived with minor injuries and became increasingly paranoid, leading to a purge within his own army to rid it of all possible suspects.
There were lots of plots to kill Hitler. And of course, today we wish at least just one of them had actually worked.
This was codenamed Operation Valkyrie. So on the 20th of July 1944, Count von Stauffenberg made a serious attempt on the Führer's life by bringing a bomb into the briefing room where Hitler was, placing it under his desk and hoping the intention of Operation Valkyrie was that it would kill Hitler.
And they don't want to get rid of Hitler because he's evil. That may be part of it. They want to get rid of Hitler because they think he's fighting the war badly. And they just are fed up with him. And indeed, Hitler is fighting the war badly because he's a terrible, terrible strategist. Bomb goes off and the whole building is basically destroyed. There's no way anybody can survive. But miracle upon miracle, Hitler survives because this oak table is so heavy, so over-engineered, that actually it absorbs so much of the blast that Hitler gets away with, I think, a perforated eardrum, some torn trousers, and a bit of shock. This is a really, really devastating blow for any resistance in the Third Reich. It comes just a month and a bit after D-Day, and of course, as the Allied forces, both Russian, American, British, Canadian, French, punch their way into the heart of the Third Reich, the resistance never quite manages to take advantage of that.
The pressure of war seemed too much for the seemingly impenetrable Führer. He retreated to a house he had built in the Obersalzberg Mountains. In 1934, he had begun renovations to extend the property and make it a fortress for his closest party members, with the intention to move here and live a quiet life, away from the chaos he had caused. Hitler increasingly spent more and more time up in the mountains, as it was secluded from all other aspects of his life. He could relax here and escape from his stressful role as the dictator of Germany. Spending most of his time at this hidden retreat only enhanced the Führer myth, but also left many questioning his dedication to Germany. Why was he hiding from his nation? When would he make another public appearance?
This is a war brought about by Hitler, and this is a war that Hitler has fought for too long, and he's fighting it to the death. And he's fighting it to the death of the people who he supposedly loves. And he no longer loves them by the end of the war. And he says that basically the German people don't deserve him, the German people don't deserve Germany, and everybody should fight to the death because basically, they don't deserve to be alive because they failed him. Classic narcissistic thinking. The world is for him, and he's not there for the world.
Whilst Hitler enjoyed a quiet life in the mountains, the very empire he had built from the ground up was withering away. After he was made aware of plans to assassinate him inside the Berghof, Hitler and his associates abandoned the mountain house.
The first half of 1945 is probably the darkest 6 months in Germany's history because it's being invaded by the Russians, the Red Army from the east, and you've got the other allies coming through from the west. And it's the Russians who reach Berlin first. And when they reach Berlin, it's a city in rubble, it's a city in flames, it's a city in chaos. It's a city in which squads of marauding loyal Nazis are going around hanging people who are not taking part in the resistance to the city. It's a city in which you then got some Nazis committing suicide. It is the most benighted, appalling place you can imagine. And you've got the Soviet army literally raping and pillaging this city.
His paranoia caused him to develop a tremor and a reliance on prescription medication to cope. This was to affect his dictation, with many losing their hope in him and making their own plans behind his back. This paranoia grew and grew as morale faltered. Soldiers rebelled, and the opposition pressed onward. Adolf Hitler's final public appearance was April 20th, 1945, wherein he handed out medals to the Hitler Youth for their dedication to the fight and urged them to continue fighting his war for him. Soviet forces fought their way through the city, aiming for the Reichstag, meters away from Hitler's bunker.
Once the Red Army came into German territory in 1945, then Hitler's position as this infallible ruler and leader really not only became to be called into question, but really came to its end. Because the Soviet troops were very vengeful. They were retaliating for all the terrible brutalities and atrocities that the Nazis and the German army had put into place in Soviet territory. What it meant was that they were coming closer and closer on their journey westwards to Berlin, and eventually Hitler and a very small inner circle around him had to retreat to his bunker, his underground bunker.
With the odds stacked so heavily against them, the German defense in Berlin were on the brink of ruin. The Führer's beloved German army were falling to the brute force and sheer firepower of the Soviet forces, an army he so arrogantly believed he could repel. By now, in the bunker, a deranged Hitler is grasping at any ideas he thinks might change the tide in the war. Refusing to accept the army as faulting, he orders more and more attacks on the enemy, deep down, knowing they can only fail. After hearing of the state Berlin is in, Hitler suffers a major mental breakdown, ranting and shouting at everyone around him, before surprisingly declaring the war is lost. Morale in the bunker was at an all-time low. Eva throws parties with the secretaries and SS men, drinking and dancing to forget the fatal position they are in.
Eva Braun is one of the more sort of kind of enigmatic figures of the Third Reich, if you like, because she was very much kept in the background by Hitler, because Hitler was very keen not to lose favour with German women by seeming, by cutting himself off with his own wife or a girlfriend.
April 27th, 1945. Berlin is surrounded by Soviet troops, clawing their way into the government district. The pressure was most certainly on. The next day, Hitler learned of Heinrich Himmler's plans to make a peace deal with the Allies and surrender to the war. This is seen as the highest treason against the Führer, and so he promptly ordered the traitor's arrest. However, Himmler had managed to flee the country without a trace, completely distancing himself from the dictator. Therefore, Hitler orders to speak with Hermann Fegelein, who was Himmler's representative in the bunker. But Fegelein, who was married to Eva Braun's sister, was also nowhere to be found in the bunker. He is traced to his apartment, found with his mistress, drunk, and with a suitcase of civilian clothes, planning an escape. Being brought back to the bunker to face the Führer's wrath, Fegelein is sentenced to death and shot without hesitation. Also, on this day, news arrived of the murder of Mussolini, dictator of Italy and Hitler's friend. Finding out he had been captured and shot, Hitler becomes determined not to allow this to become his own fate.
Hitler's last days in the Führerbunker under the Reich Chancellery in the centre of Berlin, are a kind of terrible end of a Shakespearean tragedy, as the thunder of Russian artillery all around them, and they're deep inside this sort of concrete underground fortress. Everybody's sort of kind of going mad, and especially Hitler.
The fearless leader contemplates taking his own life. He consults a doctor on this matter, coming to the conclusion he will bite down on a cyanide capsule whilst shooting himself in the head. This was no longer the terrible and terrifying harbinger of death. This was a man watching his empire crumble around him, completely stripped of all that he is, with the very thing he carelessly inflicted onto others, right at his fingertips. He turned to his secretary, Traudl Junge, and dictated his final will and testament. The short document stated that he'd chosen death over capitulation, and that he was to be cremated. Even after all his wrongdoings, he denied warmongering and expressed thanks to his loyal German citizens, encouraging them to continue his struggle to the bitter end. Another 24 hours pass. Hitler now came to terms with the fact that Germany was losing the war and is now completely beyond saving, his ego and malice being its undoing. as he inevitably slipped into insanity. His drugs were the only thing tethering his consciousness to the mortal realm. Making the most of what he perceived as his final hours, he finally agreed to marry his long-term girlfriend, Eva Braun.
Eva Braun represents everything that Hitler likes in women. He likes them to be a lot younger than him. He liked them to be, impressionable, easily led. They weren't going to challenge him in any way. He also likes them to be vivacious and bubbly, and he likes them to be very traditional. He doesn't want them to be, clever or in any way threatening or arguing with him about politics. He just wants them to be good little housefrows, back at home, doing church, children and cooking and not much more. And that's what Eva Braun represents. She's the kind of perfect Nazi girlfriend for Hitler. And so she's installed for a lot of the time in Hitler's house in the Bavarian Alps, in the Obersalzberg, this incredible kind of home he's got overlooking the most sort of beautiful scenery. And Eva Braun spends a lot of her time there. That's really out of the public view. This is a real sort of kind of Nazi hidey hole, if you like. It's very unclear as to what sort of relationship that Hitler actually had with Eva Braun. How sexualized it was, again, is impossible to say. But the fact is, it clearly was not a normal kind of relationship. It wasn't boyfriend and girlfriend. I suppose today we might call it arm candy in some way, but it wasn't public arm candy. So it's a sort of relationship that Hitler sort of thinks he should probably have to make him feel normal, but actually I don't think it's a relationship that Hitler really needs.
The pair tied the knot with what's left of Hitler's loyal advisors as witnesses in the bunker. Once the ceremony was over, Eva tried to lift everyone's mood with drinks and cheer, but with an impending sense of doom in the air, morale was low. Hitler would soon be dead. On the afternoon of April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler gathered his loyal advisors and shook their hands one by one in silence. They knew what was about to happen. Hitler took his bride into their private quarters. With a pistol in his hands and a cyanide pill in each other's fingers, they faced their ultimate fate together. One muffled gunshot later, and the Führer was no more. They removed the bodies post-haste and carried them up the stairs of the emergency exit into a small garden. Pouring petrol over their beloved Führer, the bodies are set on fire, then buried in a shallow bomb crater. Several others committed suicide in the bunker, not wanting to face their fate with the enemy. And with that, the reign of Adolf Hitler was at an end.
Basically, very little of Hitler remains. There is a bit of jawbone in an archive in Moscow, the teeth of which absolutely match Hitler's dental records. So there's no doubt that Hitler died. A lot of people like to say that Hitler escaped after the war. It's total nonsense. Hitler 100% died in Berlin on the 30th of April 1945. And with it, so did Nazism, or at least it did for a while.
Just over a week after Hitler's death, Germany surrendered. As Allied forces uncovered the death camps, the full extent of the horrors inflicted by the Nazi regime was revealed to a shocked world. The monstrous crimes of the Third Reich came to light, and surviving senior party members were swiftly arrested to face justice at the Nuremberg trials. Hitler, whose policies wrought unimaginable suffering, is remembered as one of the darkest figures in human history, a symbol of absolute evil in Europe. Between 1945 and 1949, the Soviets leveled the ruins of the Chancellery buildings in their campaign to erase the symbols of Nazi Germany. Though the Führerbunker largely survived, sections were partially flooded and damaged. In December 1947, Soviet forces made another attempt to obliterate the bunker with explosives, but only succeeded in damaging the internal walls. Determined to bury the last remnants of Hitler's regime, authorities developed the surrounding area to ensure it became unremarkable and anonymous. By design, the site of the Führerbunker would not become a place of remembrance. Many other wartime bunkers in the city that serve as tourist attractions, this site remains deliberately obscured. Only a modest sign marks its location, a quiet testament to Germany's effort to move beyond the shadow of its most infamous dictator. The Führerbunker, shrouded in anonymity, will remain hidden from public view, a silent relic of a history the world can never forget.